Hi everybody, so for this week's video, I wanted to talk about Ted Bundy. Kind of following up with the mental illness videos that I've done a couple of. Ted Bundy actually had characteristics of both narcissism and antisocial personality disorder. He did have elements of both, mainly because one of the big ones was he felt superior to other people. He really didn't care about other people. Like, he just kind of disregarded them, kind of used them to his advantage in a matter of speaking, but then just dumped them and was like, I don't care about you. You know, you're useless to me now. You've given me what you're able to give me. And that's about it. So he does have elements of both being a sociopath and being narcissistic, which is one reason I waited until after my sociopath video to talk about him. So he was born November 24th in 1946, so right after World War II. He's known to have committed 30 murders in 7 different states within about a 4-year span of 1974 to 1978. And likely that kill count is a lot higher, but he only confessed to those 30, and they couldn't find enough evidence, police couldn't, to support that he had done these other murders, but a lot of them fit his style of killing. So that's why the FBI and police believe that his kill count is a lot higher than 30. So he was born, his mom was named Eleanor Cowell, and she had him in a home for unwed mothers, and his father's identity has never been confirmed. It was believed that he was possibly a sailor in the Navy, but it was never 100% confirmed. And kind of given the circumstances of what happened to him, it's not really surprising that no father figure may have wanted to claim him as their son. So like I said, he was born to a single mother, and when she had him, she then moved back to live with her parents, who, up until he was about 3 years old, Ted actually thought that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his sister, which is kind of screwed up in my opinion, but I'm looking at it as somebody from the outside. So that may happen, that may not. It's just, for me, it's weird. And then growing up with his grandparents, he actually occasionally showed some really disturbing tendencies. Like, one of his aunts actually said that there was a time that she was spending the night with his grandparents at that house, and she had woken up and she was surrounded, like, her body was encircled with knives, like kitchen knives, like butcher knives. And Ted was just kind of standing over her smiling, thinking this was the coolest thing in the world, which is, like I said, very disturbing. And in 1951, so he was about 5 years old at this time, Eleanor married a guy named Johnny Bundy, and they had 4 children after they got married. And that's actually where Ted got his iconic last name. But Ted didn't like Johnny, because Johnny he didn't have a college education. He was not a wealthy guy. So Ted didn't see him as somebody that was worth spending time with, that was worth his time. And growing up, like I said, he had elements of being a sociopath throughout his childhood throughout his life. One part of being a sociopath is you may struggle or have issues with interpersonal relationships and making friends and just generally having a social life. There's a lot of mixed discussions about his social life growing up. Some claim that he actively chose to just kind of be a loner. Although he said that he really didn't understand interpersonal relationships and didn't have a sense of how to make them, which that's kind of the part that personally makes me believe he had some sociopathic tendencies, is he didn't understand why people wanted them. And kind of because of that, he lacked the social skills to really develop those relationships that would have made sense for people his age. So then throughout high school, he dated a little bit. He was a relatively attractive guy in high school and growing up. So he graduates high school, no major issues really to speak of. And he starts at the University of Puget Sound for a year and then transferred to the University of Washington, I believe in Tacoma. And that's where he actually starts a relationship with a young woman named Stephanie Brooks. And a couple years later, Ted dropped out of college and started working some minimum wage jobs to make money and just kind of trying to make his way through the world doing that. And during that time, he also volunteered in the office of Nelson Rockefeller for his presidential campaign and became the bodyguard and driver of Arthur Fletcher's, who I want to say was the governor of Washington at one point. I could be wrong, but he did have some sort of political career in Washington. And Stephanie Brooks, the young lady that he was dating, broke it off and actually moved home and noted that the reason that she left, the reason that she broke it off with him was because of his immaturity and lack of ambition. She just wanted she wanted to be with somebody that had ambitions and aspirations to, go somewhere. And for a lot of people, a lot of psychologists, a lot of people that are in criminology, they believe that this was kind of the turning point or the pivotal time during the development of, this is kind of regular Ted Bundy to now he's kind of becoming more of a killer, kind of wanting to make people suffer, in a matter of speaking. So after Stephanie broke up with him, he dropped out of college. Like I said, he had dropped out of college. This was after he dropped out. He moved away from Washington, actually, for a while, kind of moved around, ended up in Pennsylvania for a little bit. And his family was like, what's going on? Why are you moving around? He's like, I just can't stay in Washington because I have a lot of emotions there. It's not a good time for me to be there right now. So he did one semester at Temple University while in Pennsylvania. And then he moved back to Washington in 1969. And he met Elizabeth Klepfer. I believe that's how you pronounce her last name. And they started a relationship. And Bundy became a father figure for Klepfer's young daughter. Her name was Molly, and she actually later wrote that he was consistently sexually inappropriate with her, including indecent exposure. So something like he was possibly walking around naked, or she caught him with his pants down, or something like that. And she said that he also touched her in a sexual way. And he said, oh, this is a game. which, of course, newsflash for anybody that isn't aware, that is not okay to do with children under 18 or anybody without consent, if you're not aware of that. So then in 1970, so about a year after starting dating Stephanie, Ted re-enrolled in the University of Washington to study psychology. And he actually, this time around at Washington, he became an honor student and actually was really well regarded by his professors. He apparently did very, very well. And during that time, he was working, and he was working as a suicide hotline crisis operator next to a former police officer named Ann Rule. And later, after Bundy was convicted of all of the murders and all of the crimes that he committed, she actually wrote the book A Stranger Beside Me, all about her experience with him and just kind of her interactions with him and their relationship at work. So then about 3 years later, in 1973, despite his low LSAT scores, he was actually accepted into law school. And so he had decided to go, from my understanding. And then also in 1973, he rekindled his relationship with Stephanie Brooks, even though he was dating Klepfer. And him and Stephanie actually discussed marriage at one point, and he would actually introduce her as his fiance. And then in January of 1974, he abruptly broke it off with her, and she would try calling him, she would try writing him. He would never answer her until there was just one time that he answered, and she's like, "What the hell? What's going on?" And all he said was, "Stephanie, I have no idea what you're talking about," and hung up on her. A lot of psychiatrists and psychologists believe that this was to kind of exude that power, the control that he had craved the first time in the relationship. Now he had the control, and he wanted to end it on his terms rather than the way that it had ended on her terms. So then now I'm going to start breaking down the Washington and Oregon killings. And I'm kind of going to go like area by area and break down the crimes. So in January of 1974, Karen Sparks, she was an 18-year-old. She was bludgeoned with a metal rod that was a piece of her bed frame, and was sodomized. So it was inserted in one of her lower area cavities. And she actually survived this attack. She was unconscious for about 10 days. But she did wake up, and but she did unfortunately have a lot of physical and mental disabilities upon waking up. And during this time, there was about one female student going missing per month, roughly, from the Washington campus. So then in March of 1974, Donna Manson, who was a student at Evergreen State, left for a jazz concert. She left her dorm for a jazz concert, but never arrived. April 17th was Susan Rancourt. She disappeared while she was on the way to her dorm after a late meeting with her advisors at Central Washington State. May 6th, Roberta Parks left her dorm at Oregon State University to have coffee with some friends in Memorial Union, but never arrived. June 1st, Brenda Ball disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern. She was last seen in the parking lot with a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. June 11th, Georgianne Hawkins vanished while walking in a brightly lit alleyway between her boyfriend's dorm and her sorority house. And then July 14th, Janice Ott was asked to help load a sailboat at Lake Sammamish State Park. And a guy named Dennis, actually, who was having a picnic on the beach, saw the interaction between Ted and Janice and saw that she had left for the restroom, but then noticed that she had never returned. And during this entire time, during these initial killings, Ted was actually working in Olympia, Washington, as the assistant director of Seattle's Crime Prevention Advisory, of all things. This was one way that he was kind of able to evade people a little bit, because he was able to see how people were investigating these crimes so he could get away with it a little better. He was learning. So now I'm going to break down the Idaho, Utah, and Colorado killings. So September 2nd of 1974, an unidentified hitchhiker was raped and strangled in Idaho. By Ted. October 2nd, he abducted Nancy Wilcox, who was 16 years old at the time, in Utah. October 18th, Melissa Smith, 17 years old, who was also the daughter of a police chief, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor. October 31st, so Halloween, Laura Aim disappeared about 25 miles south of Leahy after leaving a cafe around midnight. November 8th, Deborah Kent disappeared after leaving a theater production. So then January 1975, Karen Campbell disappeared while walking down between an elevator and her room. March 15th of 75, Julie Cunningham disappeared while walking from her apartment to a dinner date. April 6th, Denise Oliverson disappeared near the Utah-Colorado border. May 6th, Lynette Culver was lured by Bundy near a high school in Idaho, kidnapped and killed. June 26th, Susan Curtis vanished from Brigham Young University, and that was actually Bundy's last confession. That was the last confession that he made, was that he killed her. So then after this was his first trial in 1975. Or his first arrest, I'll say, was August 16th of 1975. He was arrested by Utah Highway Patrol. And one reason that they pulled him over initially was he was cruising around a residential area, and then when he noticed the cop was there, he essentially sped away. And so then they chased him, and when they pulled him over finally, the officer noticed that the passenger seat and the back seats were both missing, and he had a kit full of masks, pantyhose, and other what they called tools for killing people. But they didn't have strong enough evidence to keep him on that charge alone. Klepfer, his girlfriend, was interviewed after his first arrest, and she said that she was suspicious of Bundy because he was constantly stealing things and consistently in debt. And, you know, she kind of tied the two together. They were suspicious because she didn't know how he could afford nice items when he was always in debt. But he had actually threatened to kill her if she said anything. So then in September of 1975, he sold his Volkswagen Beetle, but it was impounded by the FBI and searched, and was they found hairs from one of the victims. Thankfully, the person that he had sold it to had not started deep cleaning anything yet after he had received it. So then Bundy was in a lineup, and one of his potential victims that actually survived immediately was able to identify him. And so then in 1976, he was actually put on trial for that and found guilty, and he was given 1 to 15 years. So before I start talking about the Florida murders, I'm actually going to talk about his escapes from prison, or at least his first escape. So in 1977, Bundy was transported from Garfield County to Pickens County Courthouse because for his trial, he had actually elected to be his own attorney. Now, he had studied law for a little bit. He never, got out of law school, but he had studied for a bit in law school. So he had a basic understanding of what he was talking about. And he actually was able to request to be allowed to the courthouse's law library to research for his case. So the guards let him, and when both of the guards that were supposed to be with him were out of sight, he actually went behind a bookcase and jumped out an open window from the second floor. Now, he did injure his ankle during this time, and he hiked all throughout the Aspen Mountains and broke into a hunting cabin to steal some clothes, some food, and a rifle that were there. And then 3 days later, still hiking through the mountains, he stole a car, but was ultimately pulled over by cops, after they noticed that he was weaving in and out of his lanes quite a bit while he was driving. So then, while in prison again, during the time the other prisoners were in the shower, he was able to saw a hole that was about 1 square foot, and he lost a total of 35 pounds just so that he could sneak through the hole to get out. And he kind of stuffed under his blankets a bunch of stuff to make it look like there was a sleeping body. And none of the guards noticed for 17 hours. And by that time, he was already in Chicago. And from Chicago, he went to Tallahassee, Florida, where his Florida murders happened. So at this point, Ted's in Tallahassee, Florida. So now I'm going to break down kind of quickly the Florida murders, because the first several happened very, very quickly, all within the matter of about 15 minutes, the first ones. So in January of 1978, he entered the Florida State University Chi Omega sorority house through an unlocked rear door. First person that he kills is Margaret Bowman. She was bludgeoned with a piece of firewood and then garroted, which essentially means she was strangled from behind. Then he killed Lisa Levy. Strangled her, tore off her nipple, and bit into her butt. So just essentially just like turned her over and just bit her. And then sexually assaulted her with a bottle of hair mist. Then he killed, or at least beat, Kath Kleiner and Karen Chandler. Actually, those two both survived. Kleiner had a broken jaw and lacerated shoulder. Chandler had a concussion, broken jaw, loss of teeth, and a crushed finger. All of this happened within about 15 minutes. And the last two were because those two saw him. That's the only reason he beat them. So then he broke into a basement apartment about 8 blocks away and started attacking Cheryl Thomas. And she survived as well, but she had a dislocated shoulder and her jaw was broken in 5 places. So then a couple weeks later, on February 8th, he drove to Jacksonville, but retreated to Lake City, which is a suburb of Jacksonville, where he actually abducted Kimberly Leach, who I believe was the daughter of the police chief in that area. And then February 12th, he stole a car and started driving, but was stopped by the Pensacola police and arrested again because they realized who he was. So then now he's arrested again in Florida, and he's got his Florida trial, which starts June 1979. And he actually takes a plea deal where if he pleads guilty, he'll only get 75 years. 6 months later, he stood trial for the abduction of Leach, the daughter of the police chief. And on February 10th, 1980, he's sentenced for the third time, and this time it is death by electrocution. So then, after he was found guilty, not long after, his confession started, but he would only confess to certain people. And ultimately, although there were many stays of execution for various reasons, mainly because he was confessing, he was finally executed 9 years later on January 24th, 1989. So that is a very, very brief breakdown of Ted Bundy's life. He had kind of an odd life. Aside from a few things as a kid, he seemed relatively normal to most people. Probably more a little awkward and just kind of a social outcast, but otherwise, from what I could find, he was pretty normal. So it shocked a lot of people that he turned out the way that he did, that he ended up becoming a criminal and becoming a serial killer. But if there's any serial killers, criminals that anybody wants me to talk about, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you have any questions about any of the topics that I've covered, feel free to leave those as well. And I'll answer them to the best of my ability. Have a great day, everybody.